Kitco Mining's special coverage of the Deutsche Goldmesse is brought to you by Victoria Gold.
Is nickel becoming the new gold? This is Paul Harris for Kitco Mining at Deutsche Goldmesse in Frankfurt in Germany. Joining me today to discuss this is Martin Turenne, President and CEO of FPX Nickel. Martin, welcome to Kitco.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Paul. Appreciate it.
Now, we're at a precious metals conference and you've got a nickel project. What gives?
Yeah, I kind of snuck in the back door here somehow. I think people are understanding a bit more that nickel has a pretty fundamental role in the world, and I think so it's great to be here to be able to spread that word a little bit.
So I'm detecting from your comments there that investors are starting to become more conversant, more familiar with nickel, which for a long time has been an all-important but relatively niche base metal.
Yeah, I mean, nickel has been a four-letter word for quite a long time, both among investors and even large mining companies. It wasn't so long ago that BHP was trying to divest its nickel business, and there was just very little interest in the next generation of nickel projects among both corporates and retail investors, and that has very much changed in the last few years. It's hard to read a business section of a newspaper these days and not see an article about critical minerals and about nickel and about some of the geopolitical considerations around nickel, specifically coming out of China and Indonesia, and the environmental consequences of a lot of that production. So these are all very topical things for sure.
So the big change has been the energy transition narrative, and particularly nickel's function in EV batteries, the lithium-ion batteries that power electric vehicles.
Yes, indeed. I think nickel is at the confluence of both that trend, the trend to decarbonization, as well as those geopolitical considerations. 70% of the world's nickel supply is controlled by China and Russia. And so in a world where we want to decarbonize, we need these critical minerals. To have such high degree of dependency on countries that are not allied with the rest of the Western world is deeply problematic. And nickel really rests at the heart of those kind of almost conflicting issues, decarbonization as well as sort of geopolitical security of supply.
Now, as you mentioned, not all nickel is created equal, and whilst Indonesia is now 50% or more of the nickel supply, it's generally regarded as dirty nickel because it's largely produced with coal power and environmental practices there. Indonesia has recently been reaching out to the US government to try and help it invest to help clean up its act. What's going on there, and what are some of the geopolitical implications?
Yeah, so Indonesia is attempting to form a free trade agreement or some limited basis free trade agreement with the United States. And the purpose of that would be to gain access to some of the subsidies that are available under the Inflation Reduction Act. The IRA, as initially proposed, was really designed to beef up the security of supply for US auto production and to bring a lot of that mineral, the mining and processing back to the United States or to free trade allied countries. Now you have countries like Indonesia trying to come into the back door. And one of the lead authors of the IRA was Senator Joe Manchin, and he's coined a term recently called mineral laundering. And so that is really emblematic of what Indonesia is trying to do here, is to try to somehow get a free trade agreement that would allow their material, which is problematic in a lot of ways, to gain eligibility from an IRA standpoint. And it will be interesting to see certainly how that proceeds. I don't know that that's going to be in the best interests of North American industry in the longer term.
A key part of that, from what I've been reading, is Indonesia's desire to use or be able to acquire more green energies to fuel and power its mining industry. How feasible is that? And if Indonesia is able to reach agreements with the US, doesn't that put the US and Indonesia on a sort of collision course with China, which is also a massive investor in Indonesia?
Yeah, I mean, Indonesia is a very important country from a geopolitical standpoint. It's got a fast-growing economy, and it is a powerhouse within the Southeast Asian world. And so there is in some sense, a jockeying for position of influence between China, which has already established a fairly dominant position there, and the rest of the world, with the US trying to catch up to that. So it's become a bit of a geopolitical football, and Indonesia is trying to leverage that to its greatest personal advantage, which is totally understandable. In terms of the transition to renewable power in Indonesia, that's not something that can be done quickly or cheaply, if it can be done at all. In the assumption that it can be done, it's not clear when they can make a transition to a more fully sort of renewable power grid. And in any case, that would imply a significant increase in power costs in Indonesia, which would lift the marginal cost of production there, which would be ultimately very supportive of nickel prices.
Okay, now you mentioned the US Inflation Reduction Act. Let's switch our attention to Canada. Canada is starting to fund energy transition minerals, critical minerals as well. Recently it announced a new 1.5 billion Canadian dollar funding for critical minerals projects called the Critical Minerals Infrastructure Fund. How significant is this?
Yeah, I'd say it's somewhat significant. I think the most significant policy initiative by the Canadian government, which has not really been widely talked about because it doesn't have a precise dollar figure attached to it yet, is the 30% tax credit that is available for capital expenditures for the processing and extraction of critical minerals, which means that if, for example, a company is building $1 billion new nickel mine and all of those costs are eligible, the government is actually going to cut a check of $300 million to cover 30% of that capex. That's very significant, and that's something that could benefit many, many projects in Canada. So in terms of the $1.5 billion infrastructure fund, listen, a lot of these projects require $1 billion or more of infrastructure to build a single mine. I think, for example, of projects like the Ring of Fire in Northern Ontario, that's well known to be sort of an infrastructure challenged project. So in that context, and given those capital requirements, $1.5 billion for infrastructure for all critical minerals projects across Canada is, not as significant as it might appear based on that headline figure.
So that $1.5 billion could basically just fund one project?
If they so choose to allocate in that way, that's one way of looking at it, yes.
Okay, so if the government does want to really stimulate the development of critical mineral infrastructure, they'd have to do a fund 2, a fund 3, if that's their approach, $1 billion at a time.
Yeah, and it's questionable to me whether that is the right approach or not. I mean, I think there's room for infrastructure. I mean, I think one of the really important areas where infrastructure funding of that type can be used is to help local Indigenous communities become real economic participants in these projects, where that infrastructure can benefit the mine project, but also be a benefit to these often remote communities that are in need of these types of infrastructure upgrades around power and access and roads and that sort of thing. And so to the extent that these funds can be used to advance economic reconciliation with First Nations in Canada, I think it's great. As far as its ability to move projects forward, it's a relatively small piece of that economic pie.
A lot of the funding that's becoming available from governments is very much focused on the actual building of the mine or building of the operation. But one of the problems that has been identified is getting projects to an advanced stage that are ready to build, i.e. the real funding gap is at the exploration stage and the study stage. Why isn't more funding going to that stage?
That's difficult. I think it's difficult in part because, frankly, there's a lot of value destruction entailed by exploration and development of mining projects by Canadian junior mining companies. It's no secret that this sector is riddled with bad actors who have the potential to misuse funds or to not use them to the greatest benefit. And so government, like any other funding mechanism, whether it's a financial investor or otherwise, is very focused on risk mitigation. So that's why you see a lot of these funds are for latter stage projects that have already, proven their bona fides, that have received endorsement from other financial or other strategic investors. And so the government can come in and be almost the last dollars in. To be the first dollars in or among the first dollars in more speculative ventures, frankly, I understand why the government can be a little bit cautious in that regard. One element where they do focus is on the flow-through tax regime. My personal view is that the flow-through tax regime underwrites a lot of really inefficient early-stage exploration activities, but it doesn't underwrite the development activities, such as where our company, FPX, is, where we're doing economic studies, engineering studies, metallurgical test work, environmental baseline work, engagement with Indigenous groups. None of those costs are covered under the flow-through regime, and that's where I would like to see the flow-through regime expanded to cover those types of costs, and that would really go to sort of risk mitigation from a government standpoint, as opposed to underwriting the budgets for greenfields exploration on moose pasture by management teams that are less than serious about making discoveries.
Has there been debate in Parliament about exploration companies and their corporate largesse, the H&Bs?
I'm not aware that there has been. It would be, I'm sure it would make for an interesting discussion.
Okay, it seems some of the things that you're saying funding isn't available for in Canada is potentially available under the IRA. There's funding available in the US for studies. Is there a conscious dovetailing of what the US is doing with what Canada's doing, or are they sort of competing or just putting their incentives in place in isolation of one another?
Yeah, so we as a company have been in touch or fairly regularly in touch with Natural Resources Canada, which is the Natural Resources Ministry for the federal government in Canada, as well as the U.S. Department of Defense, which is, as you say, providing funding to feasibility stage projects. And there is, I think, some efforts there to communicate between those governments to harmonize their processes as much as possible. But what we have found to date is that the U.S. DoD funding to date has all been aimed at U.S.-based projects, that while they have talked publicly about wanting and saying that they have availability to fund Canadian projects, we've not seen evidence of that yet. And so maybe it will be interesting to see if the DoD would take the leap to actually funding Canadian projects. We'd like to see at least one of those before we can be definitive on that point.
I would imagine politically it's much easier to give funding to a US project and much more difficult to give funding to a project in a different country, even if that is Canada. Now, you're developing the Baptiste nickel project in British Columbia. You have the pre-feasibility study out early this year, and you also received a $16 million investment from stainless steel giant Outotek. Bring us up to speed with what's happening at Baptiste.
Yeah, so it's Outokumpu, which is Europe's largest stainless steel company, which now owns 9.9% of us. We've also announced more recently a battery supply chain MOU agreement with a company called Prime Planet Energy and Solutions. That is Toyota's battery company, and so that is establishing the framework for potential commercial discussions there around a potential investment they would make into FPX. So there's been nice endorsement from one of the world's largest car companies and now one of the world's largest stainless steel companies, really validating the quality of the project and of the product itself. As you said, we released a preliminary feasibility study. It shows this could be one of the world's largest nickel operations, have one of the lowest cost profiles in terms of operating costs, and also one of the lowest carbon footprints of nickel production anywhere in the world. And when we talk to consumers in the stainless business and in the auto business, that is actually an element of the project that is fundamental to them. And I think this concept of sort of green premiums or premiums for responsibly sourced nickel from countries like Canada that has a high ESG standard and a low carbon profile, I don't think that investors are paying close enough attention to that yet as a theme. And I think that Canadian projects in particular should ultimately, in the fullness of time, we will be able to pull away from a peer group in terms of valuation on that basis.
In addition to the potential for premium pricing, I imagine those kind of relationships could potentially open the door to offtake financing, because in addition to the stainless steel companies and automakers wanting clean nickel, they also want security of supply over a prolonged period of time.
That's right. Yeah, offtake financing is sort of one of the key puzzle pieces in putting together a capital stack for the development of a project like this. And so having that endorsement from large, credible counterparties who are validating the quality of the product that would be produced from this operation is hugely significant.
Now, you've had a very successful 2023. What's to come for FPX next year?
Yeah, so 2024 is going to be interesting on a number of fronts. We, having just completed the preliminary feasibility study, we will start work towards the ultimate completion of a feasibility study. That work will begin in 2024, but the completion of the feasibility study will come at a later time. We also hope to get into the initial stages of the environmental impact assessment process, which for a project of this scale involves both the federal government and the provincial government, as well as our indigenous partners. So the Baptiste project sits on the traditional territories, of 4 First Nations in British Columbia, and they will be key and integral project partners and collaborators with us through that process. Outside of Baptiste, earlier this year we signed a global generative exploration joint venture alliance with JOGMEC. JOGMEC is the Japanese state agency for mineral exploration. They are funding our geologists for the next 2 years to go out and find nickel deposits that are similar to the Baptiste deposit, which, as you may recall, is a unique style of nickel mineralization. It's not a sulfide, not a laterite. And so we think this is a disruptive new source of nickel that could come to market. JOGMEC is quite excited about that. Their entire purpose here is to source new sources of nickel specifically for the Japanese auto industry. And so we're very excited to get around the world and try to make new discoveries of this type in 2024 and beyond.
Well, I wish you the best of luck with that, Martin. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks a lot, Paul.
And this is Paul Harris for Kitco Mining at Deutsche Goldmesse in Frankfurt, Germany. And if you like what you see, don't forget to subscribe.
Kitco Mining's special coverage of the Deutsche Goldmesse is brought to you by Victoria Gold.